Welcome everybody. Today's chapter, chapter 39, is called The Conversion of Paul. No one can fail to marvel at the consummate skill with which Luke tells the story of the first 30 momentous years of the church's expansion in fewer than 30 short chapters. When we think of all that must have happened in this crucial time, of the problems the missionaries must have had to face, above all that of transposing an essentially Jewish faith into a message which would make sense to pagans who knew nothing of Palestine and had no particular love for the Jews, Luke's masterly compression of the story into one small book seems all the more astonishing. He does it by telling his story in terms of people. For this, of course, is how the Spirit of God works in the world. So Luke does not give us long descriptions of the superstitions that infested the pagan world, or a dry-as-dust chronicle of the progress and setbacks of the young church. Instead, he selects incidents in the lives of Peter and Paul and their associates. And in a series of deft thumbnail character studies, he brings to life the various people who helped or hindered them. He leaves us with a vivid impression of the jostling, bustling, workaday world of the Mediterranean seaboard, its trade and traffic, busy city streets, unruly mobs, Jewish synagogues, pagan temples, philosophers, magicians, imperial officials, wealth and poverty. And moving through it all, a small band of dedicated Christian missionaries bent on winning the world for Christ. Undaunted by every obstacle, indifferent to every threat, courageous almost beyond belief. But let us follow Luke's story from the beginning. The mission which began in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost was at first successful. This was partly due to the apostles' gift of healing, which, as in the case of Jesus, went hand in hand with their preaching. They disclaimed any personal credit for their cures, attributing them to the power of Christ working through his followers. But much of the success of the mission was due to the impression made by the apostles themselves. They were splendid advertisements for the faith they invited their countrymen to share. Loyal to their Jewish tradition, they fulfilled their religious obligations in the temple. But in addition, they met in each other's home for prayers and Eucharistic celebrations. The authority of the 12 was supreme in matters of doctrine, and in the earliest stage, the little community pooled its resources in a common fund. The fact that even in these first days of the church's story, there were black sheep within the fold is not disguised. Two unsavoury characters tried to defraud the common fund and met an untimely end, which was regarded as no more than they deserved. Outside opposition came first from the Sadducees, the powerful priestly party, whose leader Caiaphas, the high priest, had engineered the crucifixion of Jesus. From their point of view, it was intolerable that a movement which they had hoped to crush by executing its leader now showed every sign of becoming a threat to the established religion. They were dissuaded from dealing with the apostles as they dealt with Jesus by the moderate counsel of Gamaliel, a highly respected Pharisee, who, as we learn later, had been the teacher of St. Paul. And the apostles escaped with a flogging. Yet despite all threats from the authorities and an official ban on their public preaching, the apostles continued with their mission in Jerusalem, backed by strong popular support and drawing an increasing number of believers. So far, Luke has painted an idyllic picture, but one that certainly rings true. The church was a relatively small community, and despite the occasional backslider amongst its members, the enthusiasm and obvious sincerity of the apostles, their indifference to official opposition, their ministry of healing, and their message of a new life in fellowship with the risen Christ had an appeal for ordinary men and women who found little satisfaction in the rigmarole of the temple or the arid worship of the synagogues. What the apostles offered was a faith that was alive, and membership of a closely knit community that cared for all its people. But growing numbers presented their own problems. Common ownership of property proved to be no longer practicable. The 12 found the combined burden of evangelistic work and administration too much for them, and they decided to appoint an additional group of 7 men to handle the practical side of the organisation, particularly in the matter of poor relief. Since the 7 men all have Greek names, it looks as if this was also a move to give Greek-speaking Jewish Christians from overseas, now resident in Jerusalem, some share in the government of the church, side by side with the native-born Aramaic-speaking Jerusalem Christians. 2 of the 7, Stephen and Philip, now emerge as advocates of a more radical missionary approach. And it would seem that it was through these more liberal overseas Jewish Christians that the church began to break away from its exclusively Jewish background. Stephen was the first spokesman of the church to make a clear distinction between the old faith and the new. He marks a halfway stage between the conservatism of the 12 and the radicalism of St. Paul. A brilliant debater, he argued in the synagogues in defence of the Christian interpretation of the Old Testament scriptures, and brought down the wrath of the Jewish hierarchy upon his head. Hailed before the Sanhedrin, he boldly questioned the authority of the law and the value of the temple, denounced the Jews for killing the Messiah, and proclaimed his faith in Christ as Lord of all nations. This was as much as saying that the Jews were no longer the people of God, and that this role had now been given to the followers of the crucified. The disciples of Jesus had so far seemed to the authorities to belong to the lunatic fringe. Stephen's revolutionary attitude, however, appeared to them as both blasphemous and pernicious. He was rushed out of the city and stoned to death by an infuriated mob, thus becoming the first martyr for the Christian faith. He died as his master had done, praying for his murderers. And Luke tells us that among those who witnessed his death with approval was a young rabbi from Tarsus called Paul. St. Augustine dated the beginning of the conversion of Paul to Christianity as the moment when he saw Stephen battered to his knees by the stones, yet praying for forgiveness for his persecutors. The death of Stephen also marked the beginning of the persecution of the church. The more radical elements who shared Stephen's view had to flee from Jerusalem. Only the more conservative 12 and their associates were allowed to remain. However, instead of exterminating the Christian heresy, the persecution encouraged it. For wherever the fugitives went, they proclaimed their faith, and the gospel spread throughout Palestine. Notable among these evangelists was Philip, one of the 7, who broke through the ancient barrier of enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans by preaching the faith of Christ with marked success among the people of Samaria. Another step forward was taken by Philip through an apparently chance encounter with a high-ranking African official who was on his way home after attending the Jewish festival of Pentecost. This implies that the man was an adherent of the Jewish faith, like many other thinking people in the pagan world, who were attracted by the Old Testament teaching about God and Judaism's high moral standards, but who were not prepared to become full members of the Jewish community, which involved total obedience to the Mosaic law, including circumcision and rigid observance of dietary requirements. The African must have heard something in Jerusalem about the new faith, for as he rode in his carriage on the highway between Palestine and Egypt, he was reading aloud, as the custom then was, from the passage in Isaiah which speaks of the servant of the Lord. Overhearing him, Philip seized the opportunity to explain the meaning of the words in terms of Christ. The encounter ended with the baptism of the African into Christianity, and the new faith thus demolished another barrier, and move still further from its purely Jewish background. Luke now turns the spotlight on Paul, the man who is the real hero of his story. His conversion to Christianity is without doubt the most significant event in the whole history of the church. Paul, or to give him his Jewish name, Saul, had been born in the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor, the son of a rigid Jewish Pharisee, who had seen to it that his brilliant and scholarly son had been brought up according to the strictest Jewish practice. Paul's father, perhaps by purchase, had acquired Roman citizenship, to which his son was also therefore entitled. And so Paul, brought up as a Jew in a Greek city with Roman status, combined in himself the three influences that dominated the early story of the church. As part of his training to be a rabbi, Paul had studied in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, one of the greatest of the Pharisees. But he'd also learnt a trade, as was the wise practice with scholarly boys destined to be teachers of religion. In Paul's case, it was tent making, which was one of the staple industries of Tarsus. We can be pretty sure that Paul was not in Palestine during the ministry of Jesus. Being the kind of man he was, he could not have sat on the fence. We should have heard of him either as a violent opponent or a disciple. His first appearance in Luke's narrative was, as we have seen, at the stoning of Stephen. We may surmise that he had returned to Jerusalem from Tarsus some time after Pentecost to find the capital buzzing with talk of the Nazarenes, crazy followers of a man who had believed he was the Messiah and who had been properly put to death for his blasphemy. They now claimed that he had risen from the dead. There was talk of miraculous healings being performed by his disciples, and a kind of mass hysteria seemed to have seized hold on them. This was probably how Paul looked on the new Christian movement, as a staunch Pharisee who knew that the Messiah would come one day in God's good time, but certainly he could not have been a carpenter from Nazareth who died a felon's death. Following the moderate counsel of his teacher Gamaliel, Paul no doubt took the view that the whole thing was a 9 days wonder. But as a year or two went by, the Nazarene heresy, instead of dying out, gained ground and took a new and dangerous turn under the leadership of men like Stephen. It was now beginning to challenge the divine rights of the Jews to be the people of God, and the claim of the law to be God's infallible revelation of his will and purpose for the world. It seems as if Paul and Stephen, from opposite sides, were the first to see that Judaism and the new faith were like oil and water. Since arguments had failed to convince, violence might have more effect. And Luke implies that Paul not only approved of Stephen's murder, but engineered it. When the persecution of the Nazarenes broke out after Stephen's death, the most venomous scourge of the heretics was Rabbi Saul of Tarsus. With all the bigotry and cruelty of a Torquemada, he hounded men and women from their homes for beatings, imprisonment, and death, in a frenzied effort to make them recant. Not content with cleaning up Jerusalem, he got authority from the high priest to pursue these heretics wherever they might be found. It was reported that Nazarenes were stirring up trouble in the synagogues in Damascus, and Paul set out for that Syrian city with murder in his heart. It was on the road to Damascus that the incredible happened. Paul became a Christian. He left Jerusalem a bigoted, intolerant Pharisee. He arrived in Damascus shattered, humiliated, and in an agony of remorse for what he'd done. Nothing less than what Paul says himself can explain this. He came face to face with the risen Christ. In this blinding vision of Jesus of Nazareth, not as a self-deluded claimant to the title of Messiah, but as indeed the Christ of God foretold by prophet and psalmist, Paul's whole world came tumbling around his ears. It was not the Nazarenes who were crazy. It was he himself, who in his madness had been guilty of the unspeakable crime of trying to stamp out the very memory of the heaven-sent Holy One of God. We may guess with St. Augustine that Paul's conversion was not altogether a bolt from the blue. His own account of what happened suggests that for some time he'd been fighting against growing uneasiness. Could a man like Stephen, who died praying for his assassins, be an enemy of God? Could it be God's will that helpless men and women should be harried to death in the name of religion? Had Paul himself found peace with God in his meticulous obedience of the law? And when Isaiah had spoken of the suffering and death that awaited the servant of the Lord, may he not have meant the Messiah? Paul's redoubled fury against the Christians sounds like the work of a man who is trying to kill his conscience. At all events, what is certain is that from that moment on the Damascus road, he became a man in Christ, ready to face torture, imprisonment and death for the crucified carpenter of Nazareth.